He accidentally captured an Apache girl with his trap. She feared he'd harm her, but instead, James had always loved the wilderness. From the time he was a boy, he had felt a special connection to the forests, mountains, and rivers near his small hometown. While other children played in the streets, James spent hours exploring the woods, learning the ways of the animals, and observing how nature worked in silence. His father, a skilled hunter, had taught him how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits, how to spot signs of a fox, and how to survive in the wild for days without help. By the time James was 17, he had become an expert trapper. He knew which paths animals used, which rocks they preferred to hide under, and how to set traps that were clever but humane. He never wanted to hurt animals unnecessarily. To him, trapping was a way to survive, not a sport. That winter had been harsh. Snow blanketed the mountains early, and the streams froze with a thin layer of ice. Despite the cold, James was determined to gather enough food and fur to last through the season. He packed his bag carefully with essentials: a small pot, some dried meat, a blanket, and his trusty knife. Most importantly, he carried his traps, wooden snares he had spent days crafting. Each one was delicate, designed to catch an animal without injuring it too badly. He set out early one morning, the crisp air biting at his cheeks, and began checking the traps he had placed over the past week. The morning was quiet except for the occasional crow cawing in the distance. James moved carefully, listening to the crunch of the snow under his boots. He passed familiar landmarks: a twisted pine tree that marked the edge of a small ravine, a large boulder that jutted out of the snow like a giant tooth, and a frozen creek that glittered in the morning sun. He checked the first trap. It was empty. Then the second, also empty. His heart sank a little. The cold had made animals scarce, and he worried that he might return home with nothing that day. Finally, he reached a narrow canyon path where he had set his last trap. It was a tricky spot, hidden by rocks and bushes where small animals often traveled. James knelt down to inspect it and froze. The trap had caught something, but it was not what he expected. At first, he thought it was a small deer or a fox. But when he looked closer, he realized with shock that it was a girl. She was thin and young, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she tried to pull away, but the trap held her foot gently but firmly. James's heart raced. He had never seen anyone here before, except the occasional traveler or trader, and the thought of harming this girl, even by accident, filled him with dread. She was clearly frightened, and from the look in her eyes she was afraid he would hurt her. James raised his hands slowly to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. He tried to smile, hoping to show her that he was not a threat. The girl's fear did not lessen at first. She shook her head, crying softly, and tried to pull free from the trap. James realized he had to be very careful. One wrong move could injure her or make her panic. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him, not just about handling animals, but about handling tense situations. Calmness and patience were always the key. He took a deep breath, crouched down, and spoke gently again, explaining through gestures that he only wanted to help. He showed her the trap, pointing to the part that held her foot, then demonstrated how he would open it. It took time. The girl's trust did not come quickly. She watched him suspiciously, every muscle in her body tense. James noticed that she wore simple clothes made from soft leather, and her hands were calloused from work, probably gathering food or helping her family. Her eyes were sharp and alert, scanning the area constantly, as if she feared danger from every shadow. James respected her courage. She was alone in the wilderness, caught in a trap, and yet she was not screaming wildly or giving up entirely. He admired her spirit. Slowly, very slowly, James managed to loosen the trap. He moved with care, explaining with gestures that he would not hurt her. His fingers worked gently to release the catch, and at last the trap opened. The girl pulled her foot free but did not run away immediately. She stood frozen, watching him closely. James stayed still, showing her he had no weapons raised and no intention of moving toward her too quickly. He reached into his bag and took out a piece of dried meat, placing it on a flat rock between them. Then he stepped back and waited. The girl's curiosity overcame her fear. Little by little, she approached cautiously, her hands hovering over the meat, but not taking it. James smiled softly and pointed to the food, then made a small bow to show respect. Finally, after several tense minutes, she took the meat and ate slowly, still keeping one eye on him at all times. James felt a mixture of relief and wonder. He had never imagined that a simple trap check could turn into such an extraordinary encounter. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, James and the girl remained near the trap. Neither spoke, but their silent communication grew. He noticed her hands trembled slightly from fear or cold, so he offered her his blanket. She hesitated, but then took it, wrapping it around her shoulders. They were both learning, in their own ways, that understanding could cross barriers of language and culture. James thought about how fragile trust could be, and yet how important it was. One small act of care had started to change her fear into cautious acceptance. Hours passed, and James realized he could not simply leave her there, not while the canyon was dangerous and wild animals roamed nearby. He decided that he would guide her to a safer place, but he also knew that every step would require patience and sensitivity. This girl, whom he had accidentally captured, had now become his responsibility, not in the sense of ownership or control, but in the sense of protecting her until she was safe. And in protecting her, James knew he was learning something new about himself, about empathy, courage, and the power of small, kind actions. By the time the sun began to dip toward the mountains, James had earned a tentative trust from the girl. She no longer flinched when he moved, and she followed him at a careful distance. They were still strangers, yet they shared a quiet bond, forged in an extraordinary moment of accident and choice. James could not have predicted that a simple trap check would lead to such an encounter, but he felt a deep sense of purpose. Whatever came next, he knew that this day would remain in his memory forever. It was a beginning, not just of a journey through the wilderness, but of a journey of understanding and compassion that neither of them could yet fully imagine. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, but James and the girl remained in the narrow passageway, each step carefully measured. James had never experienced a moment quite like this. He had been alone in the wilderness countless times, yet now with another human being depending on him, someone he could not communicate with in words, he felt a mixture of excitement, fear, and responsibility. The girl, whose name he did not yet know, moved cautiously beside him. Her eyes darted to every movement in the trees, every sound of the wind, and every rustle in the brush. She had grown up in the wild herself, James realized, and had learned the rules of survival from an early age. She knew how dangerous the world could be, and he understood that her fear of him was partly instinct, partly caution, born from experience. James decided to continue guiding her slowly along the canyon path, hoping to find a place where she could rest safely and warm herself. He spoke softly, repeating the same comforting gestures he had used before. pointing to his heart, shaking his head gently when he moved too quickly, showing the way forward with open hands. The girl still did not speak, but her posture softened slightly. She began to walk beside him without constantly trying to escape, though she kept one hand near the blanket James had given her and the other hovering near the small knife she had carried at her waist. She was cautious, but she was learning to trust him. Bit by bit, the canyon narrowed further ahead, and James knew he had to be careful. One wrong step could mean a fall, and a loose rock could trigger a small avalanche of snow or debris. He moved slowly, testing the ground with his foot before stepping, and motioned for the girl to follow his exact path. At first, she hesitated, but as she watched his careful movements, she mirrored him. It was a small victory proof that she was willing to follow him when she saw he meant no harm. The morning passed slowly, filled with the quiet sounds of nature, the distant call of a hawk, the gentle trickle of melting snow in hidden streams, the whisper of wind through the pine trees. In that silence, an unspoken bond began to form. By midday, James realized they needed food and water. He carefully knelt beside a small stream and filled his pot with fresh, cold water. Then he offered it to the girl, cupping his hands to show her how to drink. At first, she hesitated, dipping her fingers into the water, but refusing to put them to her lips. James waited patiently, smiling and pointing to the water again, emphasizing that it was safe. Slowly she lowered her head and drank, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. James felt a wave of relief. Each small act of cooperation and trust was a step forward in a journey that could easily have turned disastrous. After drinking, James offered her a piece of dried meat from his pack. She took it hesitantly, glancing at him before eating. He watched carefully, noting every reaction, the way she chewed slowly, how her eyes never left him for too long, and how her small fingers trembled slightly from either fear or hunger. He understood that this girl had likely faced hardships beyond anything he had experienced. The wild could be unforgiving, and yet she had survived on her own, perhaps even with skill that matched his own. James admired her quietly. He had expected a frightened child, but he was beginning to see someone resourceful, intelligent, and brave. As they continued along the canyon path, James noticed signs of her people's presence: footprints in the snow, a discarded piece of bark, and the remains of a small fire. He realized that the girl might be part of a larger group somewhere nearby, but he did not want to frighten her by speaking of it. Instead, he continued his careful guidance, pointing occasionally to landmarks, showing her where the ground was safe to walk, and helping her over tricky rocks and icy patches. His movements were slow and deliberate, and he kept a careful eye on her reaction. She began to imitate some of his gestures, copying his gentle motions, and that small mimicry felt like a sign of growing trust. Around mid-afternoon, they reached a small clearing where the snow had melted into a soft patch of grass. James gestured for her to sit, spreading the blanket he carried on the ground. She hesitated, then sat, folding her knees to her chest and keeping her eyes on him. James took a seat a short distance away, careful not to crowd her space. He looked around the clearing, noting the safety it offered. Low visibility from a distance, but open enough that no animal could approach without being seen. It was a small, safe haven in the harsh wilderness. He offered her water again and motioned for her to rest. She accepted, lowering her hands slightly as she drank, though she did not speak. James took a moment to think about what had brought them here. He had come to the mountains seeking food and furs, never imagining that he would encounter a human being trapped by his own hand. He thought about the girl's fear, how natural it was, and how much courage it must have taken for her to allow him to guide her. He wondered about her family, whether they were nearby and how they would react when they found her. Would they be angry? Suspicious? Protective? The questions weighed on him, but he knew the only thing he could do now was to keep her safe. The girl, sensing perhaps a pause in his movements, glanced around the clearing. James noticed that her eyes softened slightly as she studied her surroundings. She reached toward a small patch of grass and touched it gently, almost as if testing whether it was real. James smiled quietly, understanding that in her world, survival depended on constant attention to the environment. Even this small gesture revealed her alertness and intelligence. He realized that she was not simply a frightened child. She was a young person with skills, instincts, and awareness far beyond what most people her age would possess. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed the sun dipping behind the mountains, casting golden light across the canyon walls. He knew that nightfall would bring colder temperatures and more danger. He needed to find a more secure location for them to rest. The girl watched him closely, her body tense but attentive. James understood that she was deciding whether to trust him completely, and he did not want to rush her. Slowly, he began to prepare a small shelter using branches and the blanket he carried. He worked carefully, showing her through gestures that it was a safe place to stay for the night. She watched, then helped in her own quiet way, mimicking his movements without speaking. Night began to fall, and the temperature dropped sharply. James started a small fire using flint and dry wood he had gathered. The flickering flames cast shadows across the clearing, and the girl instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. James placed a small piece of dried meat near her so she could eat while he tended the fire. She ate slowly, occasionally glancing at him with wary curiosity. Despite the language barrier, an understanding had begun to form between them. She trusted him enough to eat while he watched, and he trusted her enough to leave the fire unattended for brief moments. As darkness fully settled over the canyon, James sat quietly by the fire. The girl lay down on the blanket, still alert but no longer visibly shaking. He thought about how fragile trust could be, how a single moment of care or kindness could change fear into cautious acceptance. He knew this was only the beginning, that many challenges lay ahead, but he felt a quiet sense of hope. For the first time since he had discovered her in the trap, he believed that together they might navigate the dangers of the wilderness safely. That night, under the stars, James and the girl shared a silent connection. No words were spoken, but each understood the other in small ways. The language of patience, the gestures of care, and the unspoken promise of safety. James realized that this encounter, accidental as it was, had become something extraordinary. It was a lesson in compassion, courage, and the human capacity to connect even in the most unexpected circumstances. He did not know what the next day would bring, but he was certain of one thing: he would protect her, guide her, and continue to earn her trust, step by careful step. The next morning, the first light of dawn spilled across the canyon, turning the snow and rocks a soft pink. James stirred quietly, careful not to startle the girl who slept on the blanket nearby. He watched her for a few moments, noticing the way her chest rose and fell with each slow breath. Despite the fear in her eyes the day before, she had rested well, which gave him hope that she might be ready to trust him more today. He gently moved to check the fire, adding a few small sticks to keep it alive, and then turned his attention to their surroundings. The canyon was still quiet, almost too quiet, and he knew that the wilderness could hide dangers in every shadow. The girl woke shortly after, blinking at the light and the warmth of the fire. For a moment, she hesitated, as if unsure whether to move or stay put. James smiled softly and gestured for her to stay calm, pointing to the sun as it rose higher in the sky. He pointed to his heart and then to her, a gesture he had been using to show care and friendship. Slowly, she nodded, and the tension in her small body seemed to ease a little. It was clear to James that every small action he took, every careful step, every gentle gesture, was building a bridge between their worlds. They needed to move. James knew the canyon, while beautiful, could become dangerous if they lingered too long. Snowdrifts could hide holes, rocks could shift unexpectedly, and wild animals were always nearby. He packed their few belongings carefully, making sure the blanket was folded and the small pot was secure. The girl watched him and then began to mimic his actions, learning without words. James admired how quickly she adapted, noticing that she had intelligence and instincts that were impressive for someone so young. She clearly understood the rules of survival, and yet she had not given up on him completely, which was more than he could have hoped for. As they walked, James continued to speak softly and gesture in ways she could understand. He pointed out safe paths, showed her how to step over icy patches, and helped her navigate tricky sections of the canyon. She followed cautiously at first, but gradually she began to mirror his movements more confidently. There was still fear in her eyes, but there was also curiosity. She seemed to be studying him as much as he was studying her, learning whether he could be trusted. For James, every step was a careful dance of patience and respect. He had never felt such a strong sense of responsibility for another human being, and it made him both nervous and determined. Around midday, they came across a small stream that had begun to thaw from the morning sun. James knelt and cupped his hands, taking a sip of the cold, clear water. He offered the same to the girl, cupping his hands and showing her how to drink safely. At first, she only touched the water with her fingers, unsure whether it was safe. James waited quietly, making no sudden movements. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, she lowered her lips to the water and drank slowly. James felt a surge of relief. Trust was growing, even in the smallest ways, and he knew that these tiny victories were crucial to their journey together. After drinking, James noticed that she seemed curious about his tools. He showed her how he used the knife to cut small branches and how he set simple traps, not to capture her, but to show her how he survived in the wilderness. She watched intently, asking nothing but observing everything. James realized that knowledge was a bridge between them. Even though they could not speak the same language, he could teach her about his world, and she could teach him about hers. The idea filled him with hope. Perhaps this encounter, which had started with fear, could become something truly remarkable. As they moved further into the canyon, James began to notice signs of danger. Tracks in the snow suggested a group of wolves might be nearby, and a distant growl carried on the wind, reminding him that the wilderness was always alive and unpredictable. He knew he had to act carefully to keep the girl safe. He crouched low, examining the path ahead, and pointed to a safer route around the area where the wolves might be hiding. The girl followed his gestures exactly, stepping where he stepped, trusting him more with each cautious movement. James felt a deep sense of pride in her bravery and intelligence. She was learning to trust him fully, and he was learning to protect her with care and patience. By late afternoon, they reached a small grove of trees that offered shelter and some protection from the cold wind. James motioned for the girl to sit while he gathered small sticks and dry leaves to create a fire. She helped in her own quiet way, stacking sticks carefully and placing dry leaves near the base. James could see her confidence growing. She was no longer only a frightened child. She was a young survivor who could learn quickly and make decisions under pressure. Together, they built a small fire, and the warmth of the flames brought a sense of safety and comfort that had been missing since she had been trapped the day before. As the fire crackled, James shared some of his food with her. She ate slowly, watching him closely as he ate as well. They were still strangers, but the routine of eating together, sharing warmth, and tending to the fire was creating a bond that went beyond words. The girl began to relax slightly, leaning back against a tree, her eyes no longer darting at every sound. James noticed her looking at him occasionally, not with fear, but with curiosity and a hint of gratitude. It was a turning point. He realized that she was beginning to see him not as a stranger or a threat, but as someone who could help her survive and protect her in this harsh world. Night began to fall, and with it came the chill that could make even the bravest shiver. James guided the girl to a spot near the fire and helped her wrap the blanket around her shoulders. She still kept her knife nearby, a reminder of the world she had grown up in and the lessons she had learned about self-reliance. James respected that. He knew that trust was not about taking away her independence. It was about showing her that she could rely on someone else without fear. He settled near the fire himself, keeping watch over her while the stars began to twinkle above the canyon. As the night deepened, the girl finally spoke a few words, softly and haltingly, in her own language. James did not understand them, but he could tell they were not words of fear. He smiled and nodded, showing that he was listening, even if he could not reply in the same language. In that moment, a new connection formed between them, a bridge of gestures, expressions, and shared experiences. They had started the day as strangers, and by nightfall, they had become companions in survival, cautiously learning to trust and care for each other. James thought about the journey ahead. He did not know where her family might be, whether they would approve of him, or how he would navigate the challenges of guiding her safely through the wilderness. But he knew one thing: he would not abandon her. Every small act of kindness, every careful step, had created a bond that was strong enough to face the dangers ahead. He felt a quiet determination, a sense that this day, with all its tension and uncertainty, had changed both of their lives forever. The girl lay down near the fire, finally resting, while James kept watch. He realized that the wilderness, which had once felt like a lonely and harsh place, was now filled with possibility. They had faced fear together, built trust, and begun a journey that neither of them could have imagined when the trap was first discovered. For James, this was more than survival. It was a lesson in courage, patience, and the power of human connection. The turning point had arrived. Fear had begun to transform into trust, and the girl who had once been terrified of him was now slowly learning to rely on him. As the fire flickered and the stars shone overhead, James felt a quiet sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but the path had begun to open. Together they would face the wilderness, overcome its dangers, and perhaps discover something even more important: that kindness, patience, and understanding could create bonds stronger than fear, even in the most unexpected circumstances. The next morning the canyon was quiet and still, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. James awoke first, careful not to disturb the girl, who had slept a little more soundly than the night before. The fire had died down, leaving behind warm embers, and the early sunlight painted the snow and rocks in soft gold. James looked around, thinking carefully about their next steps. He knew that to find safety they had to leave the narrow canyon and reach the forested hills, where there would be more shelter, food, and protection from wild animals. The journey would not be easy. The girl woke soon after, stretching slowly and rubbing her eyes. James gestured gently for her to stay calm, pointing to the sky, the path ahead. and then to his heart, a silent reminder that he was there to protect her. She nodded, a small but significant sign that trust had grown between them. It was amazing to James how much could be communicated without words. Every gesture, every careful movement, every moment of patience had built a connection stronger than language itself. He smiled quietly, feeling a sense of determination. Today they would face the challenges of the canyon together. As they began walking, James noticed the tracks in the snow were deeper than usual, signs that other travelers had passed this way. Wolves, he hoped, were still far away, but he had to stay alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made the girl tense, and he gently reached out a hand to guide her. She flinched slightly, but then allowed him to lead her, following his steps exactly. James felt a mix of pride and concern. She was brave, but she was still very young and inexperienced in dealing with sudden danger. He would have to be careful to protect her without frightening her further. Halfway through the day, they reached a narrow pass between two steep cliffs. The path was treacherous, with loose rocks that could shift underfoot. James moved slowly, testing each step and showing her exactly where it was safe to walk. She followed, her trust in him now evident in the way she mirrored his every movement. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the pass. A small avalanche of snow and rocks tumbled down one side of the cliff. The girl froze in terror, eyes wide, and James acted quickly. He grabbed her hand, pulling her to a safer spot behind a large boulder. The sound of the rocks crashing past them was deafening, but they were unharmed. The girl clung to James for a moment, her small hands tight around his, and he could feel her fear. He knelt to her level and gestured gently, pointing to the sky, to the path, and then to his chest. Slowly she relaxed, realizing that he had kept her safe. That moment marked a turning point. Not only had they faced immediate danger together, but the girl had begun to fully trust him, relying on him completely to navigate the hazards of the canyon. James felt a surge of pride and relief. Every step, every patient gesture, had led to this fragile but growing bond. After the avalanche, they paused in a small clearing where a patch of grass peeked through the snow. James offered the girl some food, which she accepted without hesitation. He noticed that she was observing him closely, studying the way he moved, the tools he carried, and how he responded to the dangers around them. She was learning quickly, and James realized that she would not only survive this journey with him, but might even become a skilled guide in her own right. They shared a silent meal, the quiet of the canyon enveloping them, and James felt a growing sense of connection that went beyond words. As the afternoon sun moved lower, James spotted smoke in the distance. He knew immediately that it might be the girl's people. Excitement and worry surged through him at the same time. He had not planned to find anyone else so soon, but the possibility that her family was nearby filled him with hope. Yet he also knew that the girl might react with fear or suspicion if he approached too quickly. He crouched and pointed toward the smoke, then gestured for her to stay close. The girl's eyes lit up, but she did not run. She trusted him enough to follow his lead. They approached the area carefully, keeping low and moving quietly. James wanted to make sure they were not seen as a threat. As they drew nearer, they could see a small group of people by the fire, a family, likely her parents and siblings. The girl froze for a moment, her eyes wide with emotion. James crouched beside her, indicating with gestures that everything would be fine. She looked at him and then back at the group, her fear slowly giving way to relief. Finally, she stepped forward, guided by James's steady hand. The reunion was emotional. The girl ran toward her family, who embraced her tightly, their expressions a mixture of relief, concern, and gratitude. James stayed back, giving them space, but the girl turned and gestured for him to come closer. Hesitant at first, he walked forward slowly. The family greeted him with cautious curiosity, and James bowed slightly in respect, showing that he came with goodwill. They could not speak the same language, but the gestures, the expressions, and the shared experience of survival spoke for themselves. One of the elders approached James and gestured to the girl, then to him, speaking softly in her language. James did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He nodded respectfully and indicated that he had only wanted to help her, to keep her safe. The family's expression softened, and they motioned for him to stay, offering him a seat by their small fire. James accepted, sitting carefully and feeling a sense of accomplishment. He had not only kept the girl safe, but had earned the respect of her family, a remarkable outcome considering how the day had begun. The girl stayed close to James, her small hand brushing against his as a silent sign of gratitude and trust. The family offered them food, and James ate slowly, aware of the delicate balance of respect and communication in the moment. They were cautious but welcoming, and the girl's eyes shone with happiness and relief. James realized that the bond they had formed was now part of something larger. He had become not only a protector, but also a bridge between worlds, a symbol of trust and compassion in the midst of fear and uncertainty. As the sun set, painting the canyon in shades of pink and orange, James and the girl sat together by the fire, sharing the warmth and safety of the moment. The wilderness, which had seemed harsh and unforgiving, now felt alive with possibility and connection. James reflected on the journey they had taken, from a simple trap in the snow to a moment of trust, bravery, and human connection that neither of them could have imagined. The day's challenges had tested them both, but they had emerged stronger, bound by courage, patience, and understanding. Night fell, and the stars appeared above the canyon, glittering in the clear sky. James looked at the girl, who had finally relaxed completely, leaning against the warmth of the fire and the comfort of her family nearby. He knew that their lives had been changed forever by this accidental encounter. What had begun as fear had transformed into trust, respect, and an unexpected friendship. James realized that even in the most unexpected circumstances, kindness and courage could create bonds stronger than fear. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction and humility, knowing that he had made a difference in someone's life simply by acting with care and compassion. The night was calm, filled with the quiet sounds of the canyon and the soft crackle of the fire. James sat with the family, sharing gestures of gratitude and understanding, while the girl slept peacefully nearby. He thought about the lessons he had learned. Patience could overcome fear, small acts of kindness could create trust, and courage was not just about facing danger, but also about choosing to do what is right, even when the outcome is uncertain. The events of the day had tested him in ways he had never expected, but they had also brought him closer to understanding the strength of human connection. By the end of the evening, James knew that he had fulfilled his mission. The girl was safe, her family was reassured, and he had proven to himself that courage, patience, and empathy could change lives. The moment was quiet but profound, a turning point that would stay with him forever. The wilderness, which had once felt like a lonely and dangerous place, now seemed alive with possibility, hope, and the promise of new beginnings. The morning after the reunion, the canyon felt calmer than it had in days. The snow glistened in the sunlight, and the trees swayed gently with the wind. James woke early, as was his habit, but this time he did not feel the same tension that had filled him in previous days. He looked around at the girl and her family, who were beginning their morning routines. The girl, now smiling and moving with confidence, helped her mother prepare small bundles of food and water for their journey. She glanced at James and nodded, a quiet gesture of gratitude and acknowledgement. It was a moment of connection that spoke louder than any words. James knew that today he would leave the canyon. His time with the girl had been extraordinary, and though their paths were about to separate, he felt the importance of reflecting on everything that had happened. He packed his bag slowly, making sure to leave gifts of small food items and a few tools for the family. These were not just practical items, but symbols of his respect and friendship. The girl watched him curiously, her eyes wide as he handed over the items. James gestured to explain their purpose, pointing to the tools and mimicking their use. She nodded and smiled, understanding even without language. The family had begun their preparations to move to a safer area, and James knew he had to walk with them for a short distance to ensure they were secure before he returned to his own path. As they moved through the forested hills, the girl stayed close to him, occasionally touching his arm or hand in a gesture of comfort and trust. James felt a deep sense of responsibility and pride. In such a short time, he had built a bond with someone so brave, so observant, and so full of life. Her presence reminded him of the importance of patience, understanding, and courage, not just in survival, but in all interactions with others. As they walked, James noticed how the girl's skills and instincts had begun to blend with his own methods. She pointed out safe paths, found small edible plants, and avoided patches of snow that might hide danger. James could see that she had been a survivor long before they met, and yet she had been willing to trust him when he showed care and patience. It was a lesson he would never forget. Trust was not given lightly, but when earned, it created a bond stronger than fear, suspicion, or distance. By midday, they reached a wider valley where the sunlight warmed the snow and made the path easier to navigate. The family paused to rest, and James sat with them while they ate together. There was a sense of quiet celebration, not in words, but in gestures, smiles, and shared glances. The girl laughed softly when James demonstrated a small trick to balance on a log, her joy brightening the otherwise quiet valley. For the first time in days, James allowed himself to feel complete relief. They were safe, and the bond that had formed in the wilderness was stronger than ever. During the afternoon, the girl's father spoke to James in his language, gesturing politely. James did not understand the words, but he could sense the gratitude in the father's tone and expression. He bowed slightly, returning a gesture of respect, and smiled. The girl watched this exchange, her eyes shining with approval. She had come to trust James completely, and she could see that her family did as well. James realized that his actions, small, patient, careful, had bridged not just the gap between him and the girl, but between him and an entire family. It was a humbling and powerful moment. As the day wore on, the group prepared to separate. James had his own path to follow back through the mountains, and the girl's family would continue toward their settlement. The girl approached him quietly, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. James knelt to her level, looking into her eyes. Though they could not speak the same language, the message was clear: gratitude, respect, and the bond they had shared. He nodded, and she returned the gesture, smiling softly. It was a silent promise that their paths had crossed meaningfully, and that neither would forget the lessons learned in those days. Before parting ways, James offered the girl a small keepsake he had carried, a smooth, polished stone from the canyon that she could keep as a reminder of their time together. She accepted it with care, holding it close to her chest. He explained its significance with gestures, pointing to the stone, then to her heart, then to the sky, symbolizing memory, care, and hope. She nodded knowingly, understanding the sentiment without words. It was a small but meaningful exchange, a gesture that would forever tie them together across the distance of language and culture. As James prepared to leave, he looked back at the family and the girl. The canyon, once filled with tension and fear, now seemed alive with warmth, laughter, and trust. He had entered this wilderness alone, seeking survival and solitude, but he was leaving with something far more valuable, a profound understanding of human connection, courage, and compassion. The girl's bravery had inspired him. Her trust had humbled him, and her family's acceptance had reminded him of the strength found in kindness. The walk back through the mountains was quiet, but reflective. James moved carefully over the snow, thinking about the lessons of the past days. He realized that life often presented unexpected challenges, and it was in these moments that character, patience, and empathy were most important. The experience had shown him that fear could be transformed into trust, and that even strangers could become allies and friends through acts of care and courage. Every step reminded him of the girl's resilience, the care he had shown, and the trust that had developed between them. By evening, James reached a familiar ridge overlooking the valley below. He paused to look back, imagining the girl and her family continuing safely on their journey. A sense of peace settled over him. He had acted with integrity, patience, and courage, and in doing so, had helped someone not only survive, but thrive. He understood that life's most important moments were often those in which we acted with care for others, even when the outcome was uncertain. It was a lesson he would carry forever. As the stars appeared overhead, James set up his own small camp for the night. He reflected on the journey, the accidental trap, the initial fear, the growing trust, the dangers of the canyon, and the final reunion with the girl's family. Each moment had built upon the last, creating a story of courage, patience, and human connection. He realized that his actions had not only impacted the girl's life, but had also transformed his own understanding of empathy, bravery, and responsibility. The wilderness, once a place of survival and challenge, had become a classroom for lessons far more important than hunting or trapping. The next morning, James continued on his way, carrying not only supplies but memories and lessons that would last a lifetime. He thought of the girl often, imagining her learning, exploring, and growing safely with her family. He hoped that one day they would meet again, though he knew that their paths might never cross. Still, he felt comforted knowing that the bond they had formed was permanent in its own way, created through trust, respect, and shared experiences. The canyon, now quiet and peaceful, seemed to echo the lessons learned. Fear can be transformed into trust, courage is found in patience and care, and small acts of kindness can create bonds stronger than any distance. James realized that life's greatest adventures were not always about what was gained materially, but about what was learned about oneself and others. He had discovered the strength of human connection, the importance of empathy, and the power of acting with integrity even in difficult circumstances. As he made his way down the ridge and toward familiar paths, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The girl, once trapped and frightened, was now safe and smiling with her family. The experience had changed him forever, teaching him that patience, compassion, and courage could turn fear into trust, danger into opportunity, and strangers into allies. He knew that this story would remain with him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the power of kindness and the human spirit. By the time he returned to his own settlement, James carried not only the physical supplies he had gathered, but also the invaluable lessons of the canyon. He shared the story carefully with trusted friends, emphasizing the importance of patience, respect, and compassion. Though some doubted parts of his tale, those who listened could feel the truth in the lessons he had learned. James knew that the most important treasure he had gained was not something he could hold in his hands, but something that had forever shaped the way he understood courage, kindness, and trust. Years later, when James thought back to the moment he accidentally captured the girl in his trap, he could still see her wide eyes, hear the small sounds of her fear, and feel the tension of the moment. But he also remembered her smile, her trust, and the warmth of the family that had welcomed him. That memory reminded him that life often presents unexpected challenges, and that how one responds with care, courage, and patience can change lives in ways that are impossible to predict. James knew that the wilderness had tested him, but it had also rewarded him with lessons that would last a lifetime. He had learned that trust could be earned through patience, that courage was more than facing danger, it was choosing to do what was right, and that kindness could create bonds stronger than fear. In that quiet, reflective moment, he understood that the journey had been about much more than survival. It had been about learning to see, understand, and care for others in the most unexpected circumstances.